reading today is from Luke 24, verses 36 to 49. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of the joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written, the Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." This is the word of the Lord.
The stories of Easter, the stories of resurrection, I've been wrestling with them, I guess, the last few weeks. They're tough. They don't make sense. I just get a glimpse of what I think is there and then it disappears and something else happens. And I don't know how to hold it. Sometimes I'm confused and bewildered, sometimes excited and overwhelmed, and sometimes afraid of what this actually means. And that's what we read in the stories, because that's the response of the disciples, is fear and bewilderment and excitement and uncertainty and confusion and a whole lot of other things. Several years ago, Susan and I were invited to a special party. I think it was a special anniversary of a couple in our congregation. So we entered the hall and there were tables set out, and we were given a table, and at the table there was a couple we knew and several couples we didn't know, who were, I think, relatives and close friends of the couple from another context. And so as we sat around the table and ate, we talked, and sometimes the conversation was in small, twos and threes, and sometimes the whole table. And at one point where the whole table was engaged, someone asked one of the couples about their son. And in the response that the couple gave and the ensuing conversation, it became quite clear that this young adult son was well known. And we were supposed to know who it was. And he'd been in the media recently, and it hadn't all been easy for him. And so the conversation continued, and as they're talking, I'm trying to fit the pieces together, trying to work out, I know I'm supposed to know who this is, but... And you know how it's sort of like you're in the dark at night, you go to the toilet or something at night, and you can sort of see, if it's really dark, you can kind of see just the shadows. It was a bit like that at the start, and then, if it's a bit early, a bit later in the morning, and there's a bit more light around you, the shadows or the furniture and everything is a bit clearer, and then it gets a bit clearer. That's what it was like. As they talked, I'm getting more and more pieces of this puzzle and thinking, and I'm trying to put a face and a name to it. I'm looking for the face, and kind of in my mind, this body is coming together and a face, and I'm not sure. And sometimes that's what it's like for me looking at resurrection. It's there, but it's not, and I'm not sure. We just read one part of Luke's story of Easter. All of chapter 4 is given over to it. Chapter 24 is given over to it. It starts with the women at the tomb. They're going to the tomb to prepare the body for burial. But when they get there, the stone's rolled away and it's empty. And these angelic figures come and talk to them In Luke's gospel, angelic figures are prominent. Whenever God's got to say something, there's an angel there. It's probably I think it's the only gospel where the angels really figure like that. And they're there. And they say, why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? Didn't he tell you before he died, that he would rise again? And the women are confused and bewildered, and they run back to talk to the disciples who don't believe them and are not sure. And Peter runs and sees, but the disciples are still confused. What's going on? What's this about? What does it mean? And then it goes straight into the next story. That evening, late in the day, two disciples, two previously unnamed disciples, one's called Cleopas and the other's still unnamed, perhaps a woman, are leaving Jerusalem and walking to their village, a little village in Emmaus. And as they're walking, they're talking about these weird experiences. And they're joined by this stranger who just appears and says, what's going on? And they say, don't you know what's happened in Jerusalem? And they tell him. And then he explains from the Old Testament, the scriptures, Moses and the law and the prophets and the Psalms, as it says in the reading, holds that story and Jesus' story together and explains it and fits the Jesus story into that. For Luke, it's really important that Jesus and his story is contiguous with the Old Testament. That Jesus didn't come and do a new thing, but transform what was into what it should be. So he tells them the story and they're amazed and they're filled with wonder. And as they reach their home, he goes to walk on and they call him back, come and stay with us. And they're sitting at a table and he takes bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he hands it to them. And their eyes are open, they see who it is. And he disappears. And this is the kind of story we hear, that Jesus appears and disappears and we can't hold him. And those disciples run back to Jerusalem to tell the other disciples what they've experienced. And they're telling their story, and the disciples are not sure what to believe or think or make of any of this. And the risen Christ appears in their midst. And they're afraid. They're terrified. In Mark's Gospel, the original ending, verse 8, the women go to the tomb and they see it empty and they're terrified and they don't say anything. And that's where Mark left his Gospel. These are the stories that we read. The disciples are afraid and confused and bewildered and don't know what to do with it. And Jesus says, peace be with you. I'm not a ghost. Come, see my hands, my wounds, and my feet. Look at me. When I was around that celebration at the table, I was trying to fit a face to this person. I was trying to recognise this person, put a face, a picture of the face and the name. When Jesus comes to the disciples, it's not his face he points to, but his woundedness, his brokenness, his broken body. That's how he's recognised. And then Luke seems to go to great lengths to say this is not some disembodied spirit. In their world, as I understand it, there was a sense or the understanding that the spirit of a dead person lingered with the body for days. And sometimes people saw the spirit or saw this person. In my experience of people who have come to me, many people have come and said, some bewildered and excited and some very cautious have come and said, can I tell you something? Yeah? I was sitting having breakfast and my brother who died a couple of days ago walked through the room and said, "G'day mate, I'm okay. Tell the others I'm okay," and disappeared. Others have said, "I'm lying there wrestling with my grief and I see my mother or father or brother or sister or husband or wife at the end of the bed. Others have said, I've heard them speak to me in a voice that's as clear and obvious that it's them. Or something else that's happened that's pointed to them. And Luke is saying, that's not this. This is not some ghost or disembodied spirit. Look at me, I've got wounds, I've got flesh and bones. But at the same time, Luke's stories say he's not a resuscitated corpse. I had a friend who was operated on, he died on the operating theatre, and they resuscitated him. That's not what happened. It's a new thing, and Luke and the others are trying to describe something that's new and different and mysterious and we don't understand and can't comprehend. And how do you explain the incomprehensible when you can't even really comprehend it? This is not a resuscitated corpse, it's not a ghost, it's a resurrected, risen Christ. And what do we do with that? And as I'm wrestling with all these stories, I'm thinking, what is Luke trying to tell me? Luke's community, the community he was writing for, lived towards the end of the first century, in the 80s. So maybe 60 years after Jesus' death. Several generations. And that early church story that Luke tells in the book of Acts, all that enthusiasm and passion and energy and drive, that's waned. The Christian church is struggling. They've expected Jesus to return decades ago and consummate all things. He's coming again and the end of the world's on its way and all of that, and it hasn't happened. And they're now decades later and struggling. And when they began, they were kind of connected with the Jewish faith. It was the Christians were Jews who had experienced this new thing in Judaism, I guess. But after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, this emergent synagogue movement grew up and pushed the Christians further away from the Jews. There was separation and conflict. And the Jews became scapegoats and oppressed and persecuted in the empire under various Caesars. Life wasn't easy. What did it mean to be Christian at the end of the first century? What did it mean to be Christian in a hostile world? What did it mean to be Christian in a world that felt like it was falling apart, where there were powers and principalities and oppression and persecution and struggle? Where was the risen Christ? And I think Luke is writing his story to help the people, his people, have courage, to have faith, and to trust in this God, this risen Christ, who is not back there, but is with them now. And the stories of resurrection have to fit into the whole of Luke's story. Luke's story begins, the first two chapters, having those Christmas stories. He holds the powerful figures of the world, Caesar Augustus, King Herod, Quirinius, governor of Syria, over and against little people. There's Zechariah and Elizabeth. There's Joseph and Mary, who are nobodies. I mean, Mary is as low as you can get in the social order of the day. There's Anna and Simeon. And it's these people that God chooses to work through. The broken little people. The people who are humble. The people who are open and not full of themselves. The people who are vulnerable are the ones that God works through. And it's not in the big, grand, triumphal places, Rome or Jerusalem. It's this little outback village, Bethlehem, that even the Jewish prophets talk about as a nowhere town. That's the places where we find the Christ. He's revealed in the birth of Christ is revealed in Luke to shepherds who are down the bottom of the pecking order, not to the wealthy and the powerful and the mighty and all the other things. And it intrigues me that the resurrection experiences, the risen Christ is experienced not in the places of power and might and glory and triumph, but to this bunch of disciples who are hiding away from the world, afraid and grieving and desperate and desolate. If Jesus had a marketing guru around him wanting to witness to this great new thing, he wouldn't go to a bunch of disciples. He'd go to the flashy places, places of power, and convince them, I guess. But that's not how God works. And so for me, resurrection, the risen Christ, is not found in the triumph and the glory and the might and the power and all of that, but in the humble places of the world. Last week, a group of us went on a pilgrimage with some Palestinian Christians. We walked through the city to pray, and it was a prayer walk, emulating the prayer walk that they're doing in Palestine. They're doing 40 kilometres, we did 10, to pray for peace and a ceasefire. And amongst the stories we heard of people whose lives are broken apart, the risen Christ is present in the vulnerability and the suffering. In the places where people are torn and broken, that's where the light of Christ shines more brightly because it's dark. If we want to see Christ, go to where there's poverty and impoverishment and look into the faces of the poor, look into the faces of the lowly, look into the faces of those who have nothing, and reach out to this God in desperation. Because that's where the light of Christ will shine most brightly. And it's in our own lives when all the hope and the power and the control and is taken away, that maybe we trust God because we can't trust in ourselves. Or we know that what we own, or our career, or our education, or our homes, or our income, or our bank balance can't save us, can't restore us. It was when Mum was dying that there was nothing I could do. It was utter powerlessness and helplessness. All I could do was pray, and even that felt like very little. It was important, I guess, and it drew me closer to God. But it was in that weakness that I experienced God's grace holding me. And so I think for me, these stories of resurrection don't come to us to be held and defined and controlled, and they come to us to lead us back into the places where life needs to be renewed, where hope needs to be expressed, where faith, hope and love are needed. And all of the gospel writers send us out to be witnesses into the world, to be witnesses to bring forgiveness, to bring peace, to be people of reconciliation. In the basis of union, paragraph 3, it says the church is called to be a fellowship of reconciliation, because we are called to share the ministry of God, the mission of God in this world. And the mission of God is the reconciliation of all things into the heart of God. For all things to be drawn back into the place from where they come, where they belong, the heart of God. And these stories invite us to go out and be people of peace, hope and reconciliation, to bring peace. And the message for people that we are not alone. God is with us. Whatever happens, God is with us.